Okay, as I was saying, this is a lesson that I made a few years ago, just looking at the invasion of Afghanistan by Russia. So one thing that this course likes to emphasize is how America imposed liberalism on Afghanistan. Well, your textbook, your course conveniently skips over the fact that communism showed up first, that the Russians, the Soviet Union invaded this region of the world, and the impact that that had. So for those of you who are not aware, obviously, Russia is this big in the yellow. Down here you have Afghanistan, and there's a zoomed in map as well, but you can kind of see a bit of the world here. They have the Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, the rest of the Stan family, I like to call them. China is right there as well by Afghanistan. If we scroll down a bit, just south, here's Afghanistan. It neighbors my home country of Pakistan. It neighbors Iran as well. So Russia started to infiltrate and move south from where they were, again spreading the influence and sphere of influence of communism, trying to extend their control and dominance on the world as well. So just looking into the Sour Revolution or the April coup. So you have this individual. I highlighted them on the document here, and I won't be able to get a perfect scroll, but we'll try. So the first thing that happens is a coup. Do we know what that word means? C-O-U-P, coup. Does anyone know what that means?
A what?
A coup. Do you know what a coup is?
Like when the people attack the government.
Yeah. Sometimes it's done through the military, sometimes it's done just through the people. But when you overthrow the government, that's a coup. So this guy, Mohammed Khan, he leads a coup in 1973. And it's important to note, he leads it with the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. Okay, so democracy is a liberal value.
That's another way you call a revolution, right?
Sure, right? A revolution in the sense that they're trying to change things. Because who did they overthrow? They overthrew the king. Okay, so they got rid of their monarchy and tried to put in democracy. Okay, and that's the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. They did that in 1973. So they want to take over some of the control over the. I don't know whose music that is. Let's turn that down. Thank you. Okay, they want to take control of some of the regions of Afghanistan and northern Pakistan. The reason why that's important is because in these parts of the world, there's a lot of tribal and ethnic groups there, and so they're not all aligned, right? And that kind of relates to the invasion of Afghanistan by the Americans in the early 2000s as well, of why it's very difficult to get the country to come together, right? It would be no different than trying to get all the indigenous people to come together. There's a lot of different tribes, and not all of them get along. Okay. They were pursuing a policy of non-alignment. What that means is that they wanted their own democratic government and country of Afghanistan. They did not want to be aligned either to Russia or to America. They just wanted their own people to have, let's say, autonomy and sovereignty, make their own decisions. Okay, this is all in your notes package here. This is very similar to, I wonder if I can move that, there we go, to Yugoslavia. Okay, they're unhappy with the Soviets trying to dictate their foreign policy, and the relationship began to decay. So the communists are on the far, for you, where you're looking, on the far left of the political spectrum. And what is notable about the far left when we're talking about politics in terms of government intervention and control? Do the people on the far left, do they want more control or less? Anyone know? Come on, kids. We should know. The people on the political left, do they want more control, more government control, or less?
More.
They want more, right? The communists want to be fully in charge, centralized planning of the economy, of lifestyles, right? They want to be in control of people's lives. So the Afghanis at this point are unhappy with that. They don't want this. Okay, and go figure, like how many of you love it when your parents tell you what you can and can't do? Most of you are 17, 18, maybe 19 years old. It's not fun, right? Your parents tell you what you can and can't do. once you get to be a reasonable adult and the government starts telling you, some of you, depending on your temperament and personality, will feel similarly about the government telling you what to do, right? Or a job or a manager. Okay. Now within the People's Democratic Party, you start having factions develop. So this one group of people, they don't have a focused mission, and so they start to separate. Okay? They start to fragment and separate in that regard. On April 17, 1978, a prominent member of the opposing faction, his name is Akbar Khaibar, he was assassinated. So a member of the opposition is killed, and then this guy, Mohammed Taraki, I don't know exactly how to say the last name, he comes out with a statement that the government itself was responsible for the assassination. So now they're trying to get the people questioning the authority of the government and what they're up to, right? So you have this Democratic Party, they're in charge for a couple of years, a member of the opposition is assassinated, he's killed, right, potentially for political reasons, and then members of this government, this party, are saying that, hey, the government organized this assassination, right? It's important to remember that they're the opposition, right? So what did Stalin and Hitler do to their opposition? They purged them, they killed everyone, okay? So this then raises fears amongst all the other political parties that this guy, Mohammed Daoud, so I've highlighted every time he's mentioned in the same color, now they're scared that he might purge everyone. He might start killing all of the opposition. So if you're someone in the political party and you oppose his views and he just assassinated one of his opponents, now you might be a little concerned for your own life and for your own safety, right? So now there's turmoil. And if you think about Karl Marx's philosophy, you know, this idea that the groups of people in society are always at conflict with one another, right? If they're always at conflict, they're a little bit weaker. They're easier to attack. Right, they're just going to fight themselves. It's very easy to conquer a group of people who are fighting themselves. Okay. During Khaibar's funeral procession, there was a protest. Many of the leaders of the PDPA, they're arrested. These two names in particular we'll focus on later. During house arrest, this Hafizullah Amin is able to order an uprising. Okay, so this guy in the political party is put on house arrest for a variety of reasons. But from house arrest, he organizes an uprising to overthrow the government, who had just previously overthrown the king not that long ago. Now, Mohammed Daoud Khan finds himself in the same position that the king found himself in a couple of years ago. The people are rising up against him. So another coup is taking place, but this time to overthrow the PDPA, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. And this is very true. So I have this poster up here of the Tower of Babel, which is a story in the Bible, where essentially after the flood of Noah, you know, this group of people, they start making this tower. They have a unified society. They try to essentially, I was just listening to a video on this the other day, but within their movement, they're trying to encompass everyone. But when you take everyone into account, the differences between people within the group are more obvious, right? So like if you were to look around, let's just use the metric of skin color. There's a wide variety of skin colors in this room. So even though we're one class, it's very obvious some of us have different skin colors, just in one way. In terms of religion, maybe a little bit more difficult since it's a Catholic school. If you're at a public school, you might see Christians, Catholics, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Sikh, whatever it is, right? But that's essentially what's going on here. Like you have this group that's trying to encompass everyone. And when it does that, there's small sections in it that are all very different. They have different beliefs. And when you have a revolution, you create a lot of chaos in your society. Right? There's no real solid structure of authority. Right? So the king had some control for a while, but clearly he was doing something wrong or something bad happened. They overthrew him. Now it's not obvious who's in charge. So Mohammed Daoud Khan had political control for some time, but you know, some mistakes happened, some people died. and now there's more turbulence, right? It's not obvious what's going to happen. And so the people within his own party who maybe have different beliefs than he does, that maybe aren't so democratic, but they're using the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. Now these people are the ones that, they're trying to use that same political party for their own political motivations. They're going to try to overthrow this guy. Okay, and so that happens. That happens in April of 1978. There's a conflict that leads up to it, but I believe most of it took place right then. The president, most of his family were killed in the presidential palace, which results in a revolutionary government led by Nur Muhammad Taraki. So we just mentioned him a little bit more. So right now there's an in-between government. Okay, the Democratic Party is overthrown, the revolutionary government's in power for now. And these events, this revolution, this turbulence of who's in political control of Afghanistan, it is the precursor, so it leads to the Soviet invasion. Okay, so this other gentleman, Hafizullah Amin, the guy who ordered the coup, I believe is the guy that they put into power, but we'll get into that, okay? Anyways, he claims to the New York press that this was not a coup, but a revolution by the will of the people. And again, that's obviously may not ring as easily to all of you, but I've done a lot of research on Karl Marx and communism, their theory. But this idea that you have a revolution by the will of the people is a communist idea, right? That the workers should rise up, the average citizens should rise up, and they should overthrow the people who are ruling them, in charge of them, who are oppressing them. Okay, and so he's making that claim to the world. Okay. So the coup was initiated by, just some interesting details about the coup itself, the event. It was initiated by a tank commander who told Mohammed Daoud, the guy who was in charge of the party initially, that there was suspected intelligence of an upcoming attack on Kabul. So they essentially get this guy a little worried, neurotic about his position and authority and power. They say, hey, somebody might actually attack Kabul. So Kabul is the capital of Afghanistan. So you should set up some military defense around it to make sure that you don't get overthrown. Okay. So Mohammed Daoud, naturally, he surrounds the National Palace with tanks on the 27th of April. The tanks turn their guns on the palace and the coup begins. So it's very clever what they did. They used someone that was close to him, to Mohammed Daoud, to essentially surround the capital, to surround this palace where the government is, without actually having to fight that ground. So instead of Mohammed Daoud calling in the military that's loyal to him and fighting back the people who are partaking in this revolution, instead they just convince him, hey, actually someone's going to attack you. You should surround your palace with troops, and then you should defend yourself. Okay? And then lo and behold, on the 27th, he wakes up and all the tanks that were surrounding his palace were actually people who were against him. And they just turned the guns around, pointed on the palace. They didn't have to fight. They really didn't have to fight for much. They airstrike this palace. There's a lot of destruction, but the coup came to an abrupt end on April 28th when Daoud and his brother Naim charged out of the palace, pistols drawn, and were shot dead by the PDPA. Okay, so these two guys died like cowboys, guns drawn. Which then, a year later leads to the invasion of Afghanistan by the USSR. And it might not be obvious, why is Russia invading Afghanistan? And one thing I heard, I was listening to, of all people, two rappers talk about this. I don't know if you kids know who Immortal Technique is, or Lupe Fiasco. So they're talking about Afghanistan, the invasion, and the impact of that. And Immortal Technique was reminding people that the reason why America wants to be in Afghanistan, the reason why Russia wants to be in Afghanistan, or anyone, is because of all of the natural resources that are available in the country. So right now, Afghanistan isn't exactly an industrial country. Right? They're not very technologically advanced. They're not necessarily very incredibly modernized, at least now. Like they might have been kind of in the 50s to 70s and 80s before all these coups happened. They may have been well on their way, but there's these two forces from communism and I guess capitalism, if you're looking at it economically, that want to utilize this region of the world for economic gain, right? The Soviets wanted this just as much as the Americans would. And so that's part of the reason why Russia had an interest in Afghanistan in the first place, right? Like there's resources inside the ground, and I've watched war documentaries, and a lot of these soldiers who went and fought and had to do a couple of tours in Afghanistan do talk about how beautiful the region is, the mountain regions, right? So potentially if it was safe and it was stable, you could have a lot of tourism there as well, and it could be a very economically viable part of the world. Okay. Anyways, with the invasion of Afghanistan, somewhere between 562,000 to 2 million Afghanis are killed during this process. It lasted about 10 years, this conflict with Russia and Afghanistan. But millions of Afghanis left the country as well because, obviously there's conflict and war. The Russians gave Afghanistan an early Christmas present, December 24th, 1979. They did officially declare war against Afghanistan and begin the invasion. This lasts until February 15th, 1989. So Hafizullah Amin, the revolutionary who ordered the coup initially, he's actually killed by the Soviets, and the Soviets installed Babrak Karmal, if you recall him from earlier. He was mentioned above, but we skipped over him there, from a rival faction. So they're still taking people from within this PDPA party.
Would you like some chips?
Sure, like just for me.
They're not the good kinds, but
So the Soviets, they make sure they put in their own guy because they want political influence and control of this region, right? They want their leader in charge. In addition to this conflict, it extends out to the Islamic world as well because Afghanistan is an Islamic country. And so the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, there's 34 countries, they are demanding that Russia withdraws its troops from Afghanistan. They don't like this whatsoever. Okay. Additionally, the United Nations as well also voted against Soviet intervention. Okay, so now Afghanistan has the support of the world, not just the Islamic world, but let's call it the Western world with the United Nations as well. Like everyone acknowledges that, hey, the Russians should not be in Afghanistan. What are you doing? Why are you invading this country? Why are you extending your influence there? You have no business there. Which, this is very integral to why I teach this lesson, because again, your curriculum really emphasizes how when America invaded Afghanistan in 2004, 2006 time, that why are they imposing liberal values on Afghani people? That's not necessarily their culture, their way of doing things. Why is America there? Well, the history of why America is there will be, loosely threaded together in this document. So, Afghanistan receives massive support financially, training from various sources. So my country, Pakistan, played a big role in the training. A lot of financial aid was sent through Pakistan to Afghanistan as well, right? Keep in mind, this is a proxy war. So what a proxy war means is, let's say you have an issue with someone, so you get your buddy to beat them up for you, right? Rather than do it yourself, right? Or, you and someone else have a problem, so your friends fight, right? Rather than having a direct conflict, you use someone else to have that conflict. That's a proxy war, okay? And it's an extension of the Cold War between America and Russia because they're fighting over control, this political policy, this these two ideologies are in conflict, but they don't want a head-on-head battle because they're worried that it will lead to a nuclear conflict, right? And that's horrible for everyone. Okay. The CIA as well, the Central Intelligence Agency in America, they played a significant role in this conflict by training a lot of the people who are fighting back and resisting against Russia. And so this ends up being a bit of a global conflict here. my remote will actually work. Okay, just give me a second. I'll probably have it. There's a little picture there for you guys to look at. So much of the warfare is guerrilla warfare, which is not like traditional warfare. Guerrilla warfare, there's no organization necessarily. You're just trying to cause as much damage and hurt your enemy as much as possible. But it was a highly successful strategy for the Afghanis, who did not necessarily have a standing military, right? They weren't like the European countries. So Russia had a standing military. They had people that they trained in formation to do certain sequences and actions, and they utilized that on the battlefield elsewhere. Afghanistan's very different. You know, the terrain is very different. It's very mountainous. It's very, I guess, hilly, right? It's not like flat ground like you might see in Europe, particularly in World War II, where they had trench warfare, right? Afghanistan, has anyone seen the movie Lone Survivor? A couple of you have seen that movie, right? That takes place in Afghanistan as well. You know, these guys tumble off a mountain like quite a bit. So, you know, imagine taking an army through that area. It'd be very difficult, right? To move tanks and vehicles through that area. Anyways, a particularly important group that you should note comes to form. They're called the Mujahideen. Some of the translations, some of the meanings of that word translate to the freedom fighters. So there are people who are fighting back. They call them the Mujahideen, the freedom fighters. Okay, but they're also not one specific group. It's a bunch of factions. There's different groups within this term. Right? But these are all people who are resisting the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviets. Okay, so you have a little photo here, and clearly, as you can see, these guys aren't wearing body armor. They're not wearing a lot of gear. Their weapons are a little bit more old school. But these people are very familiar with the terrain, the environment. They grew up there, and they're defending their homeland. So it gives them a bit of extra strength, an additional push to protect their country. Okay, this photo was taken in 1985, so this is a bit later on. What else do I want to say here? So the Soviets, obviously, for whatever reason, they thought that they were just going to wipe the floor with the Afghanis. They didn't think they'd have much of a fight. It'd be a short conflict. They didn't realize that they'd be dragged into the mud for 10 years in this conflict, which ended up being very embarrassing for them. So they wanted to stabilize the government. They wanted to put their guy in place, who was Babrak Karmal. They were not ready for the fierce resistance. The military and diplomatic cost of the USSR was high, and eventually they needed to withdraw their troops. Okay, so here's just a little blurb on the financial support. So the United States was very interested in making sure the communists did not take over this region of the world, to the point that the US paid as little as 25% of the cost of this conflict. And to compare that, the Saudis at its peak were paying $20 million a month, which would be about $65 million. I did this 2 years ago, so that might be even more, considering how inflation's gone up in the last year or so. But they're paying about $70 million every month at their peak to make sure that the Afghanis don't lose this conflict. And so they're providing a lot of equipment, whatever they can, a lot of resources to help fight that. Okay, and additionally, the sources I had didn't get into the specifics, but they said that was nothing compared to donations from various entities in the Muslim world. So again, the Islamic world is also very interested in making sure that this region doesn't fall to Western influence, right? And communism is without a doubt Western philosophy. Okay. I'd actually want to show you this photo. So here's a photo of President Reagan meeting with Mujahideen in the White House. So the Americans have their own reason for being a part of this conflict. They don't want to lose their influence and control in the Persian Gulf. So in this area of the world, you know, obviously there's a lot of oil there. There's a lot of other valuable minerals and resources that they can extract. They don't want to lose their influence, right? They need all of that, all those resources as well. They provided $500,000 or $1.6 million on non-lethal aid for the Mujahideen. So, you know, this might be training, this might be support in whatever way. By the end of the war, $20 billion or about $65 billion in U.S. funds was transferred through Pakistan. Much of what was offered was weapons and anti-aircraft weaponry. So the Americans invested a whole lot of money in making sure that the Afghanis were not, that they didn't lose their influence in Afghanistan to the Russians. And hopefully I'm doing a good job explaining why that is, right? Particularly, they want the natural resources and they want the political influence in this part of the world, right? They don't want to lose that. Okay. Anyways, looking at Soviet casualties, so they lost nearly 15,000 soldiers. Nearly 426,000 of their troops got sick from various diseases. About 11,000 were left disabled. In total, 620,000 troops were sent. They lost 451 aircrafts, 147 tanks, 1,314 IFV APCs, which are like trucks and vehicles. This cost Russia almost $115 billion at 2019 prices, right? So this was financially devastating to Russia. This was, in terms of just human lives cost, this was very embarrassing. They lost a lot of people. To be quite honest, they got their asses kicked. Many people call the invasion of Afghanistan, many people call that Russia's Vietnam, right? They went in there, they thought they were gonna wipe out these untrained guerrilla warfare soldiers, these just farmers really, and then lo and behold, you know, next thing you know, they're getting their butts kicked by these Afghanis, and they don't know what to do, and they're losing people. People are dropping like flies. Okay. So part of the reason why the Russians didn't do so well here was because they had very rigid tactics. Okay, again, they had a standing army. They're very used to fighting in Europe. They're not accustomed to this guerrilla warfare. You know, they don't know how to respond to people who are essentially just making up their strategy as they go, right? And additionally, who are defending their homeland like maybe they've never seen before, right? And this time for Russia, they don't have the advantage of, you know, the rest of the world invading. So when they invaded Germany, the Russians in World War II, everybody was against Germany. So they had that advantage, right? Germany's fighting a war on two fronts. In this situation, they do not have that advantage. What else? Poor tactics, poor training, poor management. There's a lot of failures led to a lot of failures within the Soviet forces. This undermined the image of the Red Army and Soviet legitimacy. This defeat emboldened those within the USSR interested in independence. So for the Russians, for the communists, not only did they lose, but this also led to a lot of Soviet satellite states, so people who are not Russian, but were under the influence of the USSR, who were connected to it. This led to a lot of them wanting independence. Okay. So looking at some of the aftermath of the war, this is kind of where it links into, I guess, what was modern and not as much of an issue now. Well, maybe not so much, we'll see about that. So in 1989, the Soviets withdraw. They pull their troops out. Okay, they realize that they're not going to win this war. They've lost $115 billion, you know, in modern prices. They've lost tens of thousands of troops, injured hundreds of thousands more. They've embarrassed themselves. You know, they have to eventually pull out of the conflict at some point. When they do, the country, Afghanistan, then explodes into a civil war between the Mujahideen and the Afghani government and army. So all of these smaller factions and groups, they all got their own funding and training. They received equipment to fight back against the Russians, to participate in fighting back and resisting. When the resistance ended, you can't just take all that stuff back, right? It's not very easy. You'd essentially have to invade them to take it back. Well, they just beat Russia, so that's not really going to happen. Now there is a conflict between these different factions, so the Mujahideen and the government, because, again, who's supposed to rule this country now? The people who fought on the ground and bled and died for it, or the government that's supposed to be instated at some point? So the government did have some success fighting back against the Mujahideen. The Soviets under Mikhail Gorbachev attempted to make a peace negotiation and ceasefire, an attempt to cut the Soviet and American aid to the government and the guerrillas. So they're trying to slowly wean back their influence and their mistake, potentially, if we want to look at it like that, of what they did. Okay. The newly elected George H.W. Bush, so this is George Bush's dad, like George W. Bush's dad. So you wouldn't have been alive when he was in power, I don't think. He rejects the plan with an expectation of winning the war through battle. The Mujahideen were supported by America and Pakistan. The Soviet and US almost achieved an end to arms supplies. The Mujahideen won their first city in March 1991. Okay, so this group of freedom fighters who was fighting for, let's say, Afghanistan's sovereignty, their ability to be individual, make their own choices. Now they are having a conflict with the government and with America and Russia for having control over the country themselves. So essentially what happened in 1991 isn't that far off from what's happening now. Although now the Mujahideen or the Taliban have taken over, which we'll get to that shortly. The government army isn't able to hold the city, but the Mujahideen at the time weren't able to fight back properly either and to continue defending the city. But eventually the Afghani government does fall to the Mujahideen. Civil war continued for some time afterwards. The Mujahideen were not a unified force and couldn't form a unified government between 1979 to 1992. This failure eventually led to the Taliban ruling. Okay. This is where we get to more of a modern connection. So it's important to note that the Taliban is a group of Afghani people. The Taliban, the word actually just means students. So they rose out of some of the factions that were fighting back, the Islamic factions that were fighting back against the Russians, because the Mujahideen were not unified. And at this point now they're becoming a very extreme group. They have very strong religious preferences. They also want control. They want to dictate what happens in Afghanistan. So moving on to this next section of Al-Qaeda and Taliban. So much of the foundation and member base of these groups was founded in the refugee children and those who were displaced during the war. It's also important to note here, I learned later that a lot of the terrorist groups there were originally founded and funded by Saudis, right? So there's a lot of hatred in Afghanistan towards Saudis because of the turmoil that exists in their country now due to the influence that occurred, over the 70s and 80s and 90s. General Secretary Mohammed Najibullah predicted this rise in extremism and fundamentalism in 1992 and predicted that if it were allowed to continue and grow in Afghanistan, that the region would be plagued with instability and terrorism. So in 1992, they already knew that, hey, something bad's going to happen in this place. These extremist groups have a lot of weapons, they have trained soldiers, they have a lot of money, and they have very extreme views. So we need to be very careful about how we deal with this group because they're going to take away everything that we worked for. Again, the Afghani people throughout this time, they are trying to fight for their autonomy, their sovereignty. They don't want to be ruled over by another group of people. So Al-Qaeda, which translates to more or less the base or the foundation, was founded in 1988 by Osama bin Laden, who's on the left in this photo, and Abdullah Azam, who's on the right, during the Soviet-Afghan War. So again, okay, we'll just continue. Their attacks included some embassy bombings in 1998, the 9/11 attacks, which spurred the War on Terror, and the 2002 Bali bombing. So these people are committing terrorist attacks around the world, particularly on the US, which is kind of ironic considering how the US financially supported the Afghani people to resist communism. Right, and then a couple years later, now they're bombing the US, which, you know, you kids can look at the conspiracies around that as well if you want on your own. I think it's important to know. I don't know if I have a photo of it here, but I'm pretty sure Osama bin Laden, I believe he worked with the CIA. He was closely associated with America, so there's some sketchy business going on there. Anyways, the Taliban, which as I mentioned is the students, refer to themselves as the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Between 1996 and 2001, the Taliban held power over 3/4 of Afghanistan, so they had about 75% of Afghanistan's territory. They emerged as one of the most prominent factions in Afghanistan in 1994. They largely consisted of Pashtun students, so this region of the world, educated in traditional Islamic schools. Okay, so there's this short intermediary period where Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are very influential in this part of the world. They're terrorist groups. America's concerned about them as well, but more so the Al-Qaeda because they're the ones who are attacking Americans and committing bombings on other people's country. The Taliban stayed more focused on Afghanistan, and you know, currently they are the ones who rule over Afghanistan, unfortunately. The Taliban ruled with an iron hand, committing massacres, denying United Nations food supplies to 160,000 starving people. They used scorched earth policies, which is burning all the fertile land, destroying thousands of homes. They banned hobbies such as kite flying. There's a really good book. Anyone here read The Kite Runner? I believe that book is related to this event. Keeping birds was banned as well. Discriminating against religious and ethnic minorities, various cultural genocide. So again, the Taliban is a very nasty group of people who do not stand for freedom and liberal values. Okay. Which now connects to the formation of ISIS, which might be a group that you're more familiar with. So ISIS forms more or less out of an Al-Qaeda branch, the Iraqi branch by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. They too commit various crimes against humanity, human rights abuses, genocide, war crimes, cultural destruction. It's very sad what they did in Iraq. They took a lot of these very ancient sites that depicted Mesopotamian culture and history. So this is one of the earliest civilizations of the world. And they just destroyed all this stuff, this human history, because you know they didn't agree with that. It's very sad. Ethnic cleansing as well, which is obviously terrible. They pledged their allegiance to Al-Qaeda in 1999 and were part of the insurgency following the 2003 invasion of Iraq. So moving on to the last section. So invasion of Afghanistan, the war on terror. So the war on terror more or less began after the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Center in New York. George W. Bush is quoted. He says, "This is a new kind of evil, and we understand it." The American people are beginning to understand this crusade, this war on terrorism is going to take a while. And the American people must be patient. I'm going to be patient. And our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. So George W. Bush is essentially starting a war that has no end. And a war that creates a lot of casualties and a lot of enemies as well. Particularly if any of you are aware of the use of drone strikes. So the Americans, you know, they'll fly a little drone overhead, they'll send a bomb down, they'll destroy an entire house or a wedding or whatever, a market, because one terrorist is there. They end up killing, tens of hundreds of other people, innocent bystanders, and rightfully so. Like if your sibling or your parent or your brother, sister, child dies due to an American bomb, like it's very understandable that now you are very against the American government and want nothing to do with them. The invasion of Afghanistan was part of the war on terror. Troops began to invade in 2001 and are still presently there. The official name was Operation Enduring Freedom, or Enduring Freedom. It marked the beginning of airstrikes on Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Since 2001, Operation Enduring Freedoms has exceeded $150 billion in cost. So that wraps up that little mini lesson on the invasion of Afghanistan by Russia, but hopefully it helps to provide a bigger image, bigger picture, understanding of how the textbook chooses to highlight and address the issue of America invading Afghanistan in 2001, 2002 after the 9/11 strikes or terrorist attacks. But it doesn't go into some of the origins of the conflict. And that origin of the conflict, like the only reason the Taliban and Al-Qaeda exist is because, well, the Russians invaded them in the first place. And that's not to suggest that extremist groups would not have formed on their own, of their own accord and of their own time, but it was likely accelerated because other people are meddling and trying to influence this region of the world where potentially they have no business being, particularly culturally speaking. For financial reasons, sure, people can get involved for financial reasons, but they're essentially creating their own demon, their own monster that comes back to haunt them about 20 years later, which is that why they chose to attack America is not 100% clear to me. Obviously, the war on terror really changed the world, particularly changed a lot of policies in America. It enabled America to put in various forms of legislation that allowed them to spy on American citizens, to have a more, what word would I use? Their country, after that conflict, after that event, is less free, less autonomous for the individuals. There's more influence from the government in the lives of these individuals in the name of freedom to protect people. And it's not obvious if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but looking at the event more full circle and understanding how these things came to happen. Like, the Afghanis or the Al-Qaeda didn't just randomly attack the United States. They didn't just randomly form. They formed for a very particular reason. It was a result of influence from other countries, and in terms of the question of how to, should we impose liberal values on the Afghani people, well, it's very difficult, right? There may not be a tradition of democratic process in that region of the world, and so how do you just all of a sudden install that into a group of people who, do you want a snack? What's up? Yeah, it's on my desk. Yeah, so in terms of, what's happening in Afghanistan now with the Taliban taking over, the country is not in good shape. It's not very safe there. Women don't necessarily have rights there. They're practicing a very extreme fundamental form of Islam that's not very accepting of other people and of differences. So what is our responsibility as a free and democratic country to help those people out? Right? If you know that children are starving and dying for preventable reasons, that many women and children aren't being educated, many men are being killed, there's a dictatorship, there's no rule of law, there's no democracy, there's no there's no equality in the face of law. What do we do? Right? Do we just allow that? And some people might say, yes, you do, because the people of Afghanistan, the country, that government, like that nation has its own destiny, it has its own process of maturing. Like they maybe need to realize on their own what they want and what they need. Right? Like in Iran, there was that revolution, and I think it's still ongoing. I don't think they report about it anymore. But a lot of the women started resisting. What was his name? I'm sure one of you two remembers. Maybe he remembers. Who's the dictator in Iran? Maybe you remember. Khomeini, right? They're trying to get rid of the guy as well because he's ruling with an iron fist. So, you know, like, what is our responsibility? Should we go down there and fight their conflict for them? Look what happened when the Americans interjected in the Russian invasion, right? Like 20 years later, now the Twin Towers are being bombed. So, you know, these things are very complicated. What's up? Sure. Okay, I'm gonna wrap that up there.